So without further ado, let's talk about the PlayStation 5 because recently Sony did a teardown of the PlayStation 5 hardware, and there is some interesting things to take note of when it comes to the PS5. So let's go over the PS5 teardown really quickly. First and foremost, if you look at the PS5 teardown video, you will notice one thing: all the rumors and speculations were practically right about this console. You can see in the video right here that the PS5 is a very big console. It is one of the biggest consoles of all time, and honestly I'm a little surprised about this just due to the fact that we've had some very big consoles in the past. I'm talking like the Xbox One original one was like a VCR. That thing was very beefy, and then we also had the original PlayStation 3, and those consoles were very big. But for something to come out that's this big, I don't think anybody was expecting that. But yes, this console is very big, and I'm assuming for most people out there, most people are going to have to do some readjusting when it comes to their entertainment system. That's practically what we're looking at here. But again, it kind of makes sense just due to the fact that if you look at what's inside the PS5 in a second, you will see that there is a lot of components here that they actually had to put in here, and I'm going to explain why this system is so big. So there it is. But yes, it is a very big console at that. And then another thing to take note of, which is very interesting, it looks like for the hardware, you can actually set it horizontal or vertical. However, you will need to use the included stand that does come with this, no matter what orientation you want to use this with. But it is nice they do give you that option. If you wanted to put it in horizontal or a vertical stance, you can do that with the PS5. And then another thing that's actually very interesting, let me see here if I can show it. One thing that is interesting is the cooling system of the PS5. The cooling system is pretty big on this system. You can see right here with the fan is extremely big, but apparently they had to make the fans big on the PS5 for heat reasons. And another reason you want really big fans in like a gaming PC or a console or anything that really has a lot of heat is going to be the fact that it will make the system quieter in the long run. And we all know how the PS4 hardware was. The PS4 hardware was extremely noisy for a lot of people. I know not everybody may experienced the same situation with the PS4, but I am a owner of the PS4, and I can safely and strongly say that my PS4 does make quite a lot of noise when it's actually in operation, and it's definitely one of my louder pieces of technology. So anytime they can actually reduce the sound that's coming out of the system is great news. And it looks like this is the case, not only with the fan being bigger, but also everybody on the internet said, yeah, I've heard of PS5, and apparently it does sound extremely quiet. So that's why the fan is so big, and they had to put the fan somewhere, so they did decide to make the system a little bit bigger. And then another thing that is pretty important here is going to be the heat sink here. You can see the heat sink that he's holding in his hand is ginormous. It's really big, and that's probably why they made the PS5 so big to begin with, just because they had to make this really big heat sink. So of course, with a big heat sink means a big console, and of course Sony this generation really wanted to play it safe with the PS5 hardware, because we're talking about a console that's going to be producing a lot of heat. For the first time, we are going to be playing most games, if not all games, in 4K resolutions and frame rates above 60 frames per second. And in order to compensate for that, they did have to make sure this thing was going to be going to be cooled properly. And the only way to cool this properly is to have a big heat sink and to have a big fan there. So it's good news for people who may be concerned about heat issues with the PS5. It looks like heat issues aren't going to be a problem here. It looks like also noise of the PS5 is not going to be a problem either. However, we won't really know how noisy this thing is until we have this thing for many years, just because with a lot of hardware, a lot of problems don't start to creep up until we've had this thing for quite some time, and then when dust and things get in to your PS5 and you had it for a while, that's where you start to notice some issues when it comes to heat or when it comes to specifically sound. I do know the longer you have something, especially like the PS4, over time, like the thermal paste or a lot of dust gets in your system, and it pretty much makes it heat up and get extremely loud faster. So we'll have to wait and see, but so far it looks like across the board it's good news for PS5 hardware. The only thing that sucks, of course, again, is the fact that the PS5 is a very big console to begin with, which is kind of a shame, but it is what it is, and Sony really had to do this when it comes to protecting it and making sure it is the coolest thing out there. And then moving on to some Xbox Series X news. It looks like the Xbox Series X may have heat problems, but I don't think there's anything you should be concerned about this. A lot of people like to blow things out of proportion, and I agree with a lot of YouTubers and a lot of people out there talking about this story. I don't think it's a big deal because these things are extremely powerful. These things are way more powerful than what we currently have on current gen hardware like the Xbox One and the PS4. And of course, these things are going to have to generate a lot of heat, so it's to be expected. I think when something like this happens, people like to exaggerate and blow things out of proportion just so it can make headlines and make people like me talk about it. But I guess that's good because then I have something to talk about, honestly. But yeah, it's not that big of a deal because you do have to realize we're talking about a system that is actually playing 4K games, and 4K games are going to be very demanding. We're not talking about current gen games. We're not talking about cell phone games, Nintendo Switch games. We're talking about 4K capabilities, and you do have to realize as well, these things have these brand new consoles have less space in them than something like a traditional gaming PC, so of course the heat has to go somewhere. One thing that was kind of noticeable about this whole situation is a lot of people, or some people, were actually commenting on the fact that the SSD that you actually remove from the system that is proprietary can actually get extremely hot, and that shouldn't be normal. But then again, I have heard on some PCI SSD technology, it can get quite hot, and on some of them, believe it or not, they actually do have a little heat sink on the actual SSD to keep it cool, because you do have to remember these SSDs are extremely fast, and since they are extremely fast, apparently they can produce probably more heat than you were expecting. But it is kind of interesting, and kind of I wasn't expecting people to say that the SSD, when they pulled it out of the system on the side, to be pretty hot, or at least hotter than they were expecting. To put this in proportion, one person actually said that when they pulled the SSD outside of the Xbox Series X, they did actually state that they couldn't even hold it on one side. They actually ended up dropping it, and that is concerning, actually, because that should not be the case. But then again, you shouldn't be removing these things all the time. But I understand in a situation where you have too many games and you're going to buy multiple SSDs for the Xbox Series S and X, and you want to remove them from time to time, so that's a little concerning. But who knows? We'll have to wait and see when these consoles finally come out on the market to see how hot these things are actually going to be. But either way, it's not too concerning that the Xbox Series X in particular is getting hot. The only thing is, as long as it's not overheating, it's not going to be a problem. I just think people like to blow this out of proportion, and then people like to think of this as like a Red Ring of Death 2, which this is clearly not a Red Ring of Death 2. I'm pretty sure at this moment I can confidently say Microsoft and the Xbox team has really been thinking about the whole Red Ring of Death thing, and they don't want a disaster like the Red Ring of Death situation, just because it's bad for their reputation. And alongside it being bad for their reputation, you do have to realize that it costs them so much money, and since they are already losing money on these consoles when people initially buy them, they have to make their money back on accessories. They wouldn't want to lose more money by having these things overheat and having to do a whole recall like they did with the Xbox 360. It just doesn't make sense. So don't worry about this. People are just always like to make stuff up and make it seem like it's a bigger deal than realistically it's not a big deal. Granted, you do have to keep in mind one thing here, and one thing to take note of really quickly is the fact that these, I don't think, are the same systems that you are going to be getting at launch. I think they're kind of like a prototype, but even so, these are pretty much the full retail system, pretty much almost a one-on-one replication of what you would get with the in-store version of the Xbox Series X, so it's not too far off. So for the most part, I would say still don't worry about it. Now, the next story up is about Nintendo, because it looks like Nintendo is back in the news again for the Joy-Con drift. It really does seem like each and every day something new surfaces about the Joy-Con drift for the Nintendo Switch. And I know a lot of people out there are tired of hearing about Joy-Con issues and Joy-Con drift, because it's just a thing that we live with now, and it's kind of like a normal thing. As screwed up as that sounds, it's just a normal thing that we're just used to on the Nintendo Switch. But it looks like a child and their mom is actually suing Nintendo over Joy-Con drift, and it looks like, of course, this isn't the first lawsuit for the Nintendo Switch regards into the Joy-Con drift issue. A lot of companies are actually trying to sue them. Now individuals are suing them. Like you can see right here, a mom and his child are suing them. So you can see this thing, whether you believe it or not, is a really big deal. And there's more people who have Joy-Con drift on the Nintendo Switch than usual, and this is really the first system in existence to really have this much drifting issues. I know anytime you have a traditional controller that has analog sticks or thumb nubs, they can get drift on the sticks, but this one just has it so much that everybody has it that it's a really big concern. And I think this is the first console in existence to have a high rate of drifting issues. But then again, you do have to look at the Joy-Cons, and the Joy-Cons are in a different league of their own. They do have smaller thumbsticks or analog sticks than other consoles on the market that have a traditional controller. Granted, the PS Vita actually had really small thumbsticks, and most people never got drifting issues on that, or at least you never heard of anyone complaining about it. But yeah, I'm not really too surprised at this moment. This thing is a really big deal, and honestly, every time I bring this up, I think we need to just end this conversation by just telling Nintendo, go ahead and do some type of recall or give us some type of compensation. But honestly, compensation wouldn't be that great if you just gave us like money. The best thing to do was either repair ours or find a very permanent solution to the problem. But I think we're at a stage now, at least with the Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons, where I don't think Nintendo actually has a permanent solution, because obviously if they had a permanent solution to the problem, we wouldn't be hearing about Joy-Con drift anymore, and this thing would all be solved. I don't think Nintendo truly knew how to make these tiny little controllers with these little nubs on them. They're just really acceptable to drift, and they're acceptable to a lot of dirt and debris getting inside of them and messing these things up. But yeah, I hope they win this lawsuit, and I hope everybody suing Nintendo wins them. I'm not really a person that likes to go after each and every company, and I'm like, yeah, I want to get my revenge, because honestly, I love Nintendo, and I wouldn't really want to sue a company, but sometimes you have to take matters into your own hands, and sometimes the best way to do things is to actually just sue companies to get what you want out of them. And this one is a thing where I think they deserve to be sued, because they're not doing anything about the situation. They're not even acknowledging the fact that Joy-Con drift is a real issue. I know you guys, again, are probably tired of me talking about this stuff, but it is a big issue in the gaming industry and in tech. You should never have a product that comes out and has a lot of reliability issues, and that's pretty much what we're dealing with the Nintendo Switch. But good on these mom and their son for actually suing Nintendo. And it looks like they had a couple of Joy-Cons go bad. It just wasn't one pair of Joy-Cons. It looks like they had one pair of Joy-Cons, and then they bought another pair of Joy-Cons, and those went bad. And then that's when they had enough of Nintendo's problems, and they're like, yeah, we're going to go ahead and sue Nintendo. And it serves them right, because Nintendo deserves to at least acknowledge this problem even exists and does something about it. But I think Nintendo is purposely dodging this whole whole situation just because they don't have a real solution to the problem. So they're like, yeah, let's go ahead and just beat around the bush and hope nobody ever notices that the Joy-Con drift is actually a more bigger deal than we actually think it is. Now, next up, let's talk more about the Nintendo Switch. Let's talk more about the Nintendo Switch. But basically what this article is actually talking about, it's actually talking about the fact that investors and whatever they're called, basically, stockholders, investors, and things like that are basically talking about how they think the best solution for the Nintendo Switch moving on in the near future is actually going to be a business model that's more akin to things like traditional smartphones. You guys know smartphones come out on a regular basis. They come out each and every year, and that's what people in the industry think Nintendo should be doing with the Switch. Instead of just releasing more games for the Switch, they think the business model should actually be release a Nintendo Switch every 1 to 2 years. Do I think that actually makes sense, and do I think that's actually practical for the Nintendo Switch? I can see that actually working, but again, a lot of people don't realize that we're talking about video games here, and video games is a totally different market than like your traditional cell phone. For one, you do have to realize video game software is developed around a piece of hardware, and since it is developed around a piece of hardware, if you were to release a brand new Nintendo Switch each and every year, or even every other year, I think it may be a little bit complicated, to be honest, for each individual developer developing games for hardware. It may be complicated because then they may potentially have too many SKUs of the Nintendo Switch, and they may be like, yeah, I don't know how to develop my game because there's this brand new Nintendo Switch that has a lot of power, but then there's some more Nintendo Switches out there that don't have the same power, and I have to accommodate my game for each and every Switch that's out there. So it's going to take a lot of development time, it's going to be costly, it's going to be kind of hard, it could potentially delay our game, and honestly, I don't think that's what Nintendo wants here. Honestly, I don't think they would want to segregate their fan base or segregate their console that much to where they have like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 SKUs out there all at one time. It would just make everything a little bit too complicated. And if you look at something like the smartphone market is a little bit different, just because you don't have these big developers making these software specific to each model. It's a little bit more easier to have a traditional smartphone come out each and every year with more power, because everything has to be developed for just one operating system. Like for instance, iOS on the iPhone, and then each app could just run on iOS regardless of the power, so it's not that hard, since a lot of these applications are applications that are just really small and they're really just not that big a deal. But here we're talking about video games, for instance. I'm not saying this can't work, because this could clearly be a business model, and I can see this being a business model definitely, but I think Nintendo doesn't want it, and I think also the developers who develop games don't want this at all either, because it would just make things too complicated. And I also don't think actual consumers of video games like me or you want this at all, because then that just makes too many options out there on the market. It gets a little bit too confusing. We would have to readjust and things like that. But again, I'm sure this could work, but I just don't think this is the path that Nintendo wants to take with traditional gaming and things like that. Sure, it would actually make sense though, just because the Nintendo Switch is already outdated, at least when it comes to performance and when it comes to technology. So to have a Nintendo Switch that comes out like every 1 or 2 years and have modern specs would actually be nice, because then we would get bigger games, we would get better games overall. It would be awesome, but I just don't think, again, it's actually going to happen. And then the next one on my list for today, which is actually the final thing for this video, is going to be the new trailer for NBA 2K21. Here is NBA 2K21, and all this footage is actually footage on next generation hardware. So we're talking about the PS5 and the Xbox Series X and S. And what I can say is this game actually looks phenomenal, and it looks like all footage captured from a work-in-progress build of NBA 2K21 on PlayStation 5. So keep a couple of things in mind. First of all, they did say this is running on real hardware. You can read it on the bottom. It's coming from a PlayStation 5 specifically. And then they also said this is a work in progress. So, of course, this may be different from the final product. Of course, they won't vary that much. But anytime it is different than the final product, they do have to make that clear. So keep that in mind as well. And another thing to keep in mind as you watch this footage, if you've already seen it, even if you watch this on like a 4K capable screen, which this video is a 4K video because next gen does support, of course, 4K visuals, just keep in mind that there is heavy compression on the internet from when you watch this thing being streamed, and also when they upload this to YouTube, they automatically lose a little bit of fidelity. So when you play this game in real life, most likely it's going to look a little bit crispier. It's not going to be a big giant step up from what you're watching, but it is going to be slightly better. So that's something to notice as well. But yes, I just wanted to cover this because this game absolutely looks amazing. I don't think anybody's going to deny it. And usually for me, when it comes to graphics of games, the one series that I've always looked forward to seeing their graphics and their fidelity of the games was always the 2K NBA games, because NBA 2K does a phenomenal job of showing what graphics can be, at least when it comes to like the arena and especially the character models of all the NBA players and the staff and the crowd. They've always done amazing. I remember back, I think, during the 360 days, a lot of people were talking about like NBA 2K11 and 2K12, how there was sweat on the players, and that was a giant leap forward for sports games and for graphics, and this looks like it's going to be no exception here. It looks like this game is going to be an amazing game, and keep in mind, this is not even the best that 2K is going to look, just because if you think about it, this 2K game is technically kind of like a port of the current gen version of 2K21. They did have to develop this for two different generations and two different consoles with different horsepowers. So as time goes on, like maybe 3 or 4 years into the life cycle of next generation hardware, 2K is only going to get better just because they don't have to develop this same game for a lesser quality for current gen hardware. The Xbox One and PS4, those will no longer exist, and they'll stop making versions for those. Again, although they do make it for those consoles, they do support the Nintendo Switch, but I don't think that's really going to matter when it comes to graphics. I think that the next generation games look fantastic, and I think everyone agrees with me here. I think everyone can agree this game absolutely looks phenomenal and mind-blowing. Yes, I said mind-blowing because it really is a piece of art and really is a piece of work. Even if you're not a fan of what 2K traditionally does with like microtransactions, all these bad tactics in the gaming industry, even if you don't like sports games to begin with, you can admit this game looks absolutely amazing for what it is. And it looks like they're doing some specific AI modeling when it comes to all the like NPCs or all the players and all the people inside the game. It looks like they're doing some amazing work here, and apparently the crowd is going to react different each and every time to different scenarios in the game when you're actually playing. So that's something that's going to be very interesting. But overall, it's becoming so good to the point where I'm pretty sure most people, or a lot of people, if they stepped in a room to actually see this game in action and they seen someone playing this game, they might mistaken this game for something like an actual NBA game, because that's how good this game it actually looks. And yeah, I'm actually blown away. For as much as 2K gets crap, you can't say their games are actually crappy, at least when it comes to the actual sport, or when it comes to mimicking it, or when it comes to the graphics. They do amazing work. It's just too bad that this game, even though it looks amazing, they always do things like mess it up by having a lot of microtransactions and a lot of scummy tactics in the gaming industry, which I'm not particularly a fan of. Anyway, that's pretty much going to do it for today's video. Anyway, guys, this is Wayne from My Tech News, signing out.